Thanks so much for having me, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Um, I guess so. I have been asked to speak about, I guess, the US cultural impacts, but what I wanted to cover, I suppose, was the links and the exchanges between Australia and the United States, and the way that there is an increasing gap, I suppose, between the Australian government's approach to our alliance with the United States and how the public are feeling about that relationship and where they want it to go in the future. So, we've been doing quite a bit of research at the Australia Institute on public sentiment around not just the Trump presidency, but the alliance, the relationship more broadly, and also on AUKUS specifically, on the AUKUS submarine deal specifically. And what that shows us is that there is really an increasing gap between the Australian government's doubling down on the alliance, doubling down on its relationship with the Trump administration in particular, and how Australians are seeing that relationship and how they're feeling about it. So we've done some, I guess, repeat polling research around that public sentiment, and I think one of the, I guess, the headline findings of that research is that more than half of Australians now see Donald Trump as the biggest threat to global security, with very good reason. I don't think I need to explain why to this particular audience. But about over half of Australians see Trump as the biggest threat to global security, compared to 17% who see Vladimir Putin as the greatest threat to global security, and only 16% who see Xi Jinping as the greatest threat to global security. Now, that is in step with research done by other think tanks in Australia, and also international polling research. So Pew, for example, did release a poll in the last couple of weeks around global sentiment around China, and in the 36 countries that they surveyed, in almost all of those countries, what they describe as the favourability gap between the United States and China has reversed. So there is significant change going underway in public sentiment around the United States and its role in the world, not just in Australia, but internationally, and especially across the, I guess, the historic allies of the United States. In that same polling research, we found that 59% of Australians, so I think a significant majority, now support a more independent foreign policy over a closer alliance with the United States. And, if you know anything, I guess, about the history of that relationship, of that alliance, which many of you do, you will know that that's a significant shift in public opinion to have 59% of Australians more in favour of a more independent foreign policy. Yeah. And I can keep going through the numbers. Like 13% of Australians now see the United States as a very reliable ally, which is in step with European polling, where only 11% of Europeans see the United States as a reliable ally. We can keep reeling off these numbers, but basically what that is telling me, what all of that research is telling me, is that there's a seismic shift underway in how Australians view the United States. Now, what I think is really important to do is to look at how that polling is framed, especially in Australia, because what we find other think tanks doing, who are doing similar polls, the Lowy Institute, for example, has just released their big poll. What you'll see them do is talk about how Australians are separating the Trump administration, so Trump's America, from their views of the broader alliance. So Australians are entirely capable of seeing that, Trump's America is one version of the United States, but it's not the only version. I think we have to be skeptical of that framing, because while it is true, while Australians know that, this is one version of America, it's not the only version of America, and that an America with which we share values, we share values such as democracy and the rule of law, absolutely does exist. As Auntie Sue just said, there are some Yankees that we don't want to get rid of. We do have this sense of solidarity with Americans who are under siege, Americans whose democratic institutions are under siege. And I would always argue that the polling that we are seeing doesn't necessarily represent a wish on the part of Australians to abandon the United States. It's reflective of a deep concern and a deep sorrow at what is happening in the United States. And I think that that important nuance is often skated over. But what also happens is that think tanks, public figures with an interest in the alliance existing in a certain way will say that Australians are separating Trump from their support of the alliance, which is rock solid. And certainly some polling does say, Australians support our alliance with the United States. They think the United States is important to our security. But I am somewhat skeptical of that framing because I would argue what that does is conflate the alliance, the capital A alliance that Cameron was talking about, that military industrial complex integration with that broader relationship. So it's conflating Australian support for Americans, it's conflating our solidarity with Americans who are under siege with support for a deeper integration militarily with the Trump administration or whichever administration is in charge. And I think it's really important to push back on that framing and to note that Australians are particularly interested in solidarity with our American friends, again, who are under attack. And so that's the way that I'm pushing back on some of that framing coming out of the government and coming out of other think tanks. We heard Christopher Pyne at the AUKUS public inquiry say something very similar the other day, that the alliance is bigger than prime ministers or presidents. And again, that's true. The alliance has survived for 75 years. Of course, it's bigger than prime ministers or presidents. But that to me is used as a get out of jail free card. It's used as cover for doubling down on the Trump administration. And I think from our perspective, that is, as many of you will know, deeply risky and deeply dangerous for Australia. And what it actually does, what this doubling down on the Trump administration does, what this intense fear of making Trump upset and making the potential for him to abandon AUKUS is blinker the relationship so badly that not only is it ignoring the rest of that relationship and the shared values upon which it is supposed to be built, but it is horribly undermining that relationship and our broader solidarity with the United States because the government is so deeply focused only on the Trump administration. And as far as we can tell, admittedly from the outside, I'm not in the government, I don't have any kind of special access. But from what I can see, the government is only talking to the Trump administration. It's not talking to or engaging with its progressive allies in the United States, people in the United States who have a deep interest in the survival and the thriving of American democracy, people with which we should share interests, and certainly a Labor government should share interests. And strategically, for me, that's kind of bewildering. Like, how is it that a Labor government in particular is not engaging with its progressive colleagues in Congress? And strategically, again, I think that's potentially a disaster, because it's entirely possible that the United States, this version of the United States will go away and the for progressive forces in the left will help to revitalize the United States, as Mamdani is doing in New York. And I think it's entirely possible that just like when Trump was elected the first time, if the Democrats return to power, if there is a revitalization of American democracy in this way, the Australian government will be left scrambling. And do they think that progressive allies in the United States won't remember that Australia didn't engage with them for the entirety of the Trump administration? And so my great concern is that the way that broader relationship, the way that our shared values of democracy are being catastrophically undermined by the government's approach, and the way that is also undermining, I guess, faith in a Labor government, faith in progressive politics here in Australia as well, when that gap is so big between what the public is saying and what the government is doing. And I think from the perspective of, I guess, pushing back on this alliance and pushing back on AUKUS in particular, we have this huge opportunity now because of that gap. And to continually remind the government, to continually remind Australians that the last federal election in Australia was, at least in part, a referendum on Trumpism in Australia. Peter Dutton lost his seat in part because he attempted to be Trump light, or a Timu Trump, as my colleague Amy Romakis likes to say. And the Australian government's delivered a very clear message on that front. That election result was a clear endorsement of keeping Trumpism, keeping that kind of politics out of Australia. And I think we have a huge opportunity to really lean into that, to lean into the best of the shared values that we have with the forces of democracy, of democratic accountability in Australia and in the United States. And in that sense, I think that Trump and AUKUS, as Cameron said, offer us a huge opportunity. So I'm really glad to be talking to you about that today, and to be taking part, I think, in this show of solidarity alongside the ALP National Conference is such an important piece of work, and I'm really grateful to IPAN for doing that. So I'll leave it there and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Emma. Another great talk. The great talks just keep rolling this morning, don't they? Thank you so much. And there was a lot in there, and particularly your very important advice for the Australian government and others that we need to take a much, much longer view of our relations with other nations other than just who's in power right at the moment, and look beyond that. So thank you very much, Emma.